Hi, this is Alex Bryant. Welcome to the East West Associates webinar on planned closures, consolidation, relocation. This webinar is the first webinar in a four-part specific series for companies with China-based operations, manufacturing operations. The remaining three webinars will address later topics such as performance improvements, ground restructuring, operational assessments, sales growth, but we're focusing this one simply on closures, consolidations, and relocations. As we move forward into the next slide, we've got a six-part series lined up today. We're going to keep this at 1 hour, so we will not be running over. On a point of housekeeping, if you have a question, please feel free to pull up the questions and ask them. If we don't get to all of them, we'll come back to you directly after the webinar. We will be doing a recording of this webinar, and we will be posting that on our website. The topics are going to be closure, consolidation, relocation. Just for a point of reference here, the consolidation strategy that companies engage usually involves closing 2 to 3 or a number of facilities down to a smaller number, like closing 3, consolidating 3 down to 1, and that usually is the result of the work we're doing on the manufacturing footprint analysis and evaluation. And then that results into closures and relocation. So that's what we're focusing on today. And at the end of this, we'll have 3 case studies for you. The next slide is going to be covering this is a little bit about the people that we have on the ground at East West and a little bit about who we are. We'll move through this pretty quickly. East West was started in 2005. We operate on the ground in 4 markets: China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Central Eastern Europe. The team that we have are all individuals who have really one qualification, and that is they have had P&L responsibilities to run companies on the ground in our areas that we focus on: China, Southeast Asia, Central Eastern Europe, and Mexico. They had to have that responsibility, P&L responsibilities. Each of the individuals that work with East West came up in different functional skill sets. Some were in sales, some were in manufacturing, some were in marketing, some were in procurement, some were in human resources, but they all came up and had P&L responsibilities for running a Western company on the ground in that particular market. And most people we have are local nationals on the ground in these different regions. Let me introduce the 2 speakers, Dan McLeod and Jay Honig. Dan, if you would give yourself a background, please.
Sure, thanks, Alex. Name is Dan McLeod. My background is primarily operations management and also management of capital project delivery, either new factory design and construction or major expansions. Spent most of my career in the chemical industry, and of that, 21 years in Asia, living and working in China for 13 years, and then covering the region out of Singapore for 7 years, but also spent a year running an operation in the Philippines. The last few years with East West, I've been managing projects globally, both Asia, but also in Central Europe and Mexico and the US for our clients. Jay?
Great, thanks so much. Jay, would you give a background yourself, please?
Yeah, my name's Jay Honig. I've spent much of my career with large international engineering and construction firms, as well as risk management, enterprise risk management consulting, having to do with unethical behavior, FCPA, IP theft, cybersecurity, due diligence, those types of issues. I served as chairman of the American Chamber for a number of years. I started my activities in China since 1989, and have worked and lived there for over 20 years.
Great, thank you, Jay. So on the topic of consolidations and closures and relocations, East West and our team, we closed, relocated, and consolidated over 65 facilities in China, all over China. So we've got today's webinar will be kind of sharing the advice and opinions we've gotten from doing those over 65 operations. The expertise that we've got on the ground kind of focuses on these 9 different services. Today's focus will primarily be on strategic business planning, manufacturing footprint, and risk management is ones we'll be covering. As we go to this area, you can see where we operate. Obviously, 3 companies based out of the U.S. We operate in China, we operate in Mexico, and we operate in Central Eastern Europe, and we operate in Southeast Asia. Primarily right now, a lot of the activity occurring in Mexico and occurring in Central Eastern Europe and occurring in Southeast Asia. A lot of that is companies who are looking to diversify beyond China. They are all not necessarily, these companies are not leaving China in many cases. Some of them are closing operations there. Some of them are looking to leave China, but there's also a group that is staying in China but needing to diversify and beyond China. So these are where our team members reside in these 5 regions. Here are the lists of kind of the core focus of the different industries we operate in. You can see we do a variety of different industries, but today's webinar, we're going to focus on our 3 case studies. The first case study will involve automotive, second case study will involve chemical, and the third case study will involve heavy appliances. So at this point, I will then stop and I'll turn this over to Dan McLeod, and Dan, let you pick it up and take it from here. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Alex. I'd like to transition into a bit of the changing business environment and trends that we've seen in the last several years in China that have, in general and overall, made it somewhat more difficult for multinationals to operate in the environment. Recent surveys, and one by AmCham in Shanghai in particular, have indicated that high percentage, 40% of U.S. firms are either moving or considering moving operations out of China. And overall, multinationals are reassessing their China expansion plans. Whereas some years ago, China was a key focus for many companies to expand in either for the local market or for export. Many companies are taking more of a wait and see approach and or restructuring their domestic supply chain and looking to implement more of a China in China for China model. And with that, exporters and companies that originally went to China 20, 25 years ago to reduce costs are finding that they can't maintain that cost competitiveness, and they're leaving. And in the case of high labor component manufacturing, much of that activity is moving to Southeast Asia. The market in China has grown, has become mature, and domestic competition is increasingly capable and sophisticated. So that's, again, creating challenges for multinationals operating in the environment. The threat from domestic competition continues to get more intense. And finally, the issues that have been in place for a number of years and recognized and are pain points for many multinationals operating in China around corporate governance, business ethics, IP theft. Although we've seen improvements, although many companies have seen improvements, there's still a long ways to go, and there's still a large gap between what companies would expect in the West versus operating in China, which continues to make things challenging. Next slide, Alex.
Sure.
Some of the drivers for closure, consolidation, and relocation over the last several years, what we've seen. One, we talked to a lot of clients, and we've been involved in several projects where, for lack of a better term, urban renewal is driving it. And, many factories by multinationals were built on the outskirts of major cities, in the 1990s. And what we found is those cities have grown and expanded and now surround those factories. And local governments and development zones are looking to move out industry and replace them with housing, commercial or retail space, higher value space. And so companies are being encouraged, or in many cases told, that they need to move. Environmental policies in China have, and the application of them, the enforcement of them, have really stepped up in the last few years. Those increased focus on environmental performance have added cost to companies, but also a desire, particularly in the process industries, to move out of the cities and relocate to industrial zones, parks that are specifically targeted at that sort of industry with the appropriate infrastructure, environmental wastewater treatment, environmental compliance requirements. Tariffs have facilitated an exit of manufacturers out of China, and it's been going on for over 2 years now. And people we talk to, both in industry and in the government, don't expect that to change anytime soon. And so that's being factored into plans and accelerated move out of China for at least some portion of manufacturing to Southeast Asia, Europe, or Mexico. And finally, migration of a customer base, the labor force and suppliers in the country has forced companies to look at their current locations. The development of the western part of the country, moving from the developed East Coast to the west of suppliers and customers, and also access to available labor, has prompted many multinationals to look to expand their footprint or move entirely from the east to the west.
Dan, we had
Okay.
a question that popped up around mergers, acquisitions, and the question was, have you seen an increase in M&A activity as a result of the COVID or since the COVID in the last year?
We see a lot. We see an increase in discussion. We see an increase in interest because in many cases, there were winners and losers out of COVID, and some companies, quite honestly, were struggling, and they may be appropriate for an acquisition. But lack of ability to travel into China now is creating we can get so far in the process, but when it comes time to actually make a decision on a deal, most companies want to have their senior executives actually visit the target. So it's limited. There's interest and taking it through the exploratory steps, but as far as actually pulling the trigger, seems to be slow due to travel restrictions.
Yeah, face to face, yes.
Face to face. Couple of headlines from the news in the last several months, talking a little bit of environmental protection program has accelerated relocation, particularly in the process industries that have been built in general industrial zones and now are being forced to move to specific industry parks. Urban renewal, as we mentioned, crowding out of industrial space in the major cities, looking to either relocate further outside of town or actually either farther west. And when we talk about expanded infrastructure, really access to markets in the western part of the country, logistics, transport systems, logistics have improved, generally increasing incomes in the West, created new markets there, and it's really forcing companies to look west and evaluate expansion and relocation away from the east and further west. So, and talk a little bit about the evolving challenges of plant closures. What sort of hurdles that companies are seeing. And at this point, I wanted to highlight, and we'll talk about this in more detail. Jay will talk about it in more detail, but really, when you're undertaking a plan to close or relocate, it's important to get a multifunctional team involved to understand all the different aspects from the regulatory standpoint, the customer standpoint, the government relations aspects, to develop a very thorough, disciplined risk mitigation program and implementation plan. Next slide, Alex. Some of the key challenges as the workforce has become more mature, more educated, and has honestly in the last 10 years gone through and seen more factory closures. They've become more aware through the media particularly, and more militant in their demands for severance pay. The labor laws in place are generally pro-labor, and much more so than U.S. companies would expect in the U.S. market. Retroactive HR compliance. Well, what that means is, particularly for a company that may have acquired a local company in the years past, where we see problems is over years, if social benefit payments haven't been made over time, payments haven't complied with the regulations. This tends to get trued up and at the time of a closure, announcement of a closure. And very often, clients can be surprised by the bill and be required to pay that. And so understanding that history and practices in the past are vital in planning for a closure. We see increased incidents of threats and sit-ins, violent activity that's gone up over the years. And for those companies that are looking to move, there is more challenges around permitting. The permit cycles are taking longer. Corporate registrations are taking longer than they did in years past, and that needs to be factored into any plans around a relocation. It could take you much longer than to get established in a new geography than what you experienced 15 years ago, for example. Next slide, Alex.
Dan, before we leave that slide, I got a second question. And again, if we don't get to all the questions, please keep sending them in. But if we don't get all the questions, we'll get back to you after the webinar is over. One question, you talked earlier about the environmental protection and some of the laws. What effect are you all seeing when it comes to the environmental protection, which is obviously on the rise in China? The question is, what impacts are you seeing on closures and relocations as it relates to environmental protection laws?
Okay. Well, a couple of things. The cost of compliance is much higher than it was a few years ago, both for required treatment technologies and for taxation for emissions, certainly. It also impacts desire of regulators and the government to move factories into designated zones. So that creates more opportunity, more opportunity to move and more drive to move. And I guess finally, the regulatory environment has shifted significantly in the last few years. And by that, I mean, 5 years ago, there was much more collaboration between regulators and manufacturers. If you had a problem, you generally worked to a solution and you implemented it, and both sides were satisfied. Now it's much more confrontational. Inspections are more frequent, and very often the result of an inspection is a shutdown and correct it decree rather than to work through the problem together. And that's also prompting companies that are in more environmentally sensitive areas to look for other locations.
Okay. All right.
And some of the changing dynamics over the last few years that impact downsizing. Previous unethical behavior of some foreign invested enterprises. And this started 2009, 2010 with the recession that had a huge impact on factory closures and shutdowns. And we've seen estimates of anywhere from 30 to 35 million employees being displaced at that time. And many cases were reported of where factories were closed and the doors locked and equipment moved out, maybe during a holiday, and the employees returned, and not only didn't they have a job, but they were owed a substantial amount of back pay. So those stories have become part of the culture and through media and social media, and so you find a much more skeptical and militant workforce now than you did some years ago. Most companies don't have experience in planning and for downsizing, particularly in China, which is can be difficult from a regulatory and cultural standpoint. So it's imperative to think through the problem and develop a plan, and again go back to a multifunctional team that can address all the different stakeholders. Employees now have, in many cases, unrealistic termination expectations around severance. It's important for factories, manufacturers to understand the precedent set in the area and understand what both the legal and sort of generally accepted obligations would be. And finally, one key difference is sort of lack of support from local governments and the police in a downsizing activity. And here it's very important to maintain those relationships, have those relationships, and proactively work with the local governments and police to when anticipating downsizing. So there will be less intervention if something goes awry than you might expect for a similar situation in the U.S. And the demographics and the political situation has certainly changed over the last few years. China is faced with a shrinking workforce, and so that workforce peaked about 6 years ago and has been declining. So there's fewer younger workers, growing numbers of factories. So the competition for labor has become intense, even more intense, and again the sophistication of the labor force and their demands and what they expect have increased over the last several years. And in the case of migrant workers, which have staffed the manufacturing sector for a couple decades now, you're into the second generation, which are much more selective in the jobs they take, much more aware of their rights, and are sensitive to inequality, and particularly in the case of a downsizing activity, what they believe is owed to them. And the social safety net that was in place for years, where the migrants came from a farming background, that's becoming less and less common now. The migrant workforce is very often used to being in cities. They don't have the farming experience to fall back on. They don't have that aspect of social safety net. So it makes them somewhat more militant in dealing with labor relations. And what we see as a result of that is more common to see threats against a company and the management that could prove to factory sit-in, disruption of headquarter operations, very, very strong social media campaigns. You can't overemphasize the role of social media in China culture now. It's exploded in the last, and it doesn't take very long to get the word out. So additionally, work stoppage and management lockouts are common. Sabotage of products and facilities and theft become more common, and occasionally riots and physical damage to the property. So those are the kind of challenges that you'd effectively plan for and mitigate when planning a shutdown. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jay.
Okay, thanks, Dan. What I'd like to do is first of all suggest that what we are presenting is somewhat of the worst case scenarios of what can happen. You know, the hostage taking and sabotage of products and so forth. And much of this started back around 2009, 2010, as Dan mentioned, where we had the financial crisis, and an awful lot of people were furloughed, if you will, and some stood up, not getting severance pay and so forth. It wasn't until that time that you didn't see many foreign companies shutting down. Reason being, it was still boom times, if you will, in China. So there wasn't a whole lot of experience with these multinationals on how to deal with a shutdown. And then you had the reaction by employees that in many cases it wasn't a favorable reaction, if you will. So it was sort of an unknown territory that we found ourselves in 2009 and 10, and it continued until today. What I'd like to present is somewhat of a walkthrough of lessons learned and some of the actions that you might want to consider when you're closing a facility. It's sort of a how-to, if you will. First and foremost, you got to secure the plant and you have to protect your management staff. You don't know what is going to happen. The last thing you need are surprises. So you've got to secure your assets and protect your people. If your security vendor, if it's an outside third-party vendor, or if it's your own employees, you need to really have an assessment or make an assessment on whether or not they're going to join those that might want to create some unrest, and do they have the experience on how to neutralize and handle unrest. Most cases they don't. This is the security vendors are not that experienced in dealing with this sort of issue. As Dan mentioned, the first and foremost, we would recommend putting together a multifunctional team and have that team, quite frankly, led by a professional firm that has done this many times. It includes HR, it includes legal, operations, management, security, and work through the risks, how you're going to mitigate those risks, and put a functional plan in place, which basically says who's in charge, what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, where we're going to do it. That is almost most of our experience. If companies will do that, the outcomes generally are quite successful. And you'll see in some of the case studies, if that's not the case, things can turn south very, very, very quickly. Next slide. So again, one of the first things you want to do with your crisis management plan is go back and look at the history. What is the labor history of that particular facility and company? Have there been strikes before? Have there been sit downs? Have there been any type of militancy? And basically, you'll be able to uncover that fairly quickly. And I think that sort of sets the stage as to the level of detail you want to go into mitigating your risk. We also find that in the past, there's been some compromises, if you will, relative to social compliance programs and tax obligations. For instance, migrant workers would rather be paid in cash as opposed to contributing to social welfare programs and so forth. And sometimes companies will do that, but then when you're shut down, these same employees may go to the Labor Bureau and say, look, we haven't been paid for this or that, and so forth. And you might get stuck with some back payment issues and maybe even a fine. Most importantly, understand what is the severance compensation precedent in the local area, whether you're in a development zone, whether you're outside of the zone, but in an area where there are a lot of factories. Guaranteed your employees will know exactly what the severance packages were and what the benefits were when a facility closed in the immediate area. And you can consider that as probably the minimum that you're going to pay. Next slide, please. So how do you make the announcement? How do you announce that the factory is going to close? We highly recommend that you use a senior Chinese national manager that can do it in Mandarin. Of course, if you're in Guangdong, and you want to do it in Cantonese, and be able to to communicate in English as well. And you want to do that in a town hall setting, but not in the factory. Excuse me. The reason being, should you have some unrest, the PSB is not going to come onto the property. If you do it offsite, for instance, optimal place would be a development zone building, or 2-star, 3-star hotel. They will go to an outside, the PSB will go to an outside location, but they will not go in to your company property, and they consider that to be a commercial issue that you have to deal with. HR, again, we recommend that employees are notified of the closure and explained in detail what the severance packages will be. And that means a lot of preparation by HR staff. They are going to be in the room, and as most of you know, you have to have each employee sign off that they agree with the severance package and that they're going to receive. A lot of cases we will recommend, if you will, call it a sign out bonus. For instance, if the prevailing severance package is N+2 or N+3, which is years of service plus 2 months or 3 months salary, recommend enticing them to sign on that day at the meeting with a sign out bonus. Maybe you give another month's salary, or maybe you make it N+2 plus a 1 month sign out bonus. So different ways to look at it. By and large, the majority of the employees are going to accept the terms, and that's usually the case. It differs a little bit whether you're talking to migrant workers or whether you're talking to local workers. They tend to have different agendas, if you will. But normally it's just a small handful of people that are going to try to create some trouble, and hopefully you know who those people are before you make those announcements. A lot of discussion around notifying the PSB, Labor Bureau, Tax Bureau, and so forth. Regulations suggest or require, I guess, that you notify the Labor Bureau 1 month in advance. Sometimes we question that. It depends on the relationship you have with the Labor Bureau. We definitely recommend you notify them ahead of time, but 1 month in some cases might give people the opportunity to leak that information, and that may cause some problems when you make the announcement. So know how much guanche you have, and whether or not you think you can keep they can keep the information confidential until the date of announcement. PSB, obviously, you want to put them on notice at least a week or so ahead in case you need to call them. They typically will not get involved. They, again, consider it a company issue, and the threshold for them getting involved really is physical violence and injury and so forth, which at that point in time they will come in and they will take charge, which sometimes works well and sometimes doesn't, depending on how they react. And obviously you want to let your customers and suppliers and others know that you're going to make a shutdown, or you're going to have a shutdown, but their product's not going to be curtailed, and you'll continue serving them from other areas. So And once,
Jay, excuse me, before you jump forward, we had a question come up. The question was, how far in advance should a company plan? If you're planning a closure, you're planning a relocation or consolidation, how long should a company plan on taking itself to kind of think through their own strategy of how they want to do it and hire the right resources? How long would most companies take to do that?
well, it really depends on the size of the closure, the complexity of the closure, the size of the company, and how many people are going to get involved. Is there a large regional management team? Is there a large, corporate organization that wants to stay involved? I'd say a minimum of 1 month. And we've had situations where we've planned almost 4 months in advance. Again, depending on the size and complexity.
Yeah, and that was followed by a second question, which is, what's the largest one East West has done, the smallest one?
Largest has been about 1,500 employees.
Yeah.
Due to an M&A and the closure of that facility. Smallest was, I would say, a small factory, not 50, 60 people.
Yeah, I think that's probably exactly right. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, so you've got your security team. You've put security in place during the announcement at the plant as well as at the hotel to protect the management staff. You've secured and stabilized the assets of the company, and now you want to get into demobilizing and into the documentation required for deregistration and working with the tax bureau, labor bureau, and so forth. This takes as much as 6 to 9 months to officially close it out. But once employees are gone, all you need to do is obviously demobilize, get rid of the assets, and make sure that the property is secure. Next slide. So let's look at some basic recommendations. And you'll see these played out in the case studies. Most important, again, is to engage a multifunctional team with management members that will keep this confidential. And that obviously includes both expat and local team members. Make sure that you're aligned with your regional management and your corporate management, because when there is a crisis, someone has to make decisions very quickly. So some decision maker from the client needs to be put in charge, and they need to be aware that they may be asked to make some very tough decisions on it. Identify obviously the threats, do your crisis management planning, know who, what, where, when, and how you're going to make announcements and close the facility. You want to avoid the flashpoints, the town hall meetings on the premises. Make sure you know who's going to make the closure messaging and have an appropriate severance package. Most of you know that labor law requires N+1 month's salary. I don't know many companies that have done that in the past. Certainly foreign companies. The prevailing is considerably more than that. And then at the right time, liaise with the Labor Bureau and PSB and local development zone officials and so forth. If you're a large company and you're concerned about brand reputation, you might want to put a media relations plan in place, have that ready to be rolled out at the proper time. Obviously notify your clients and vendors and suppliers to make sure that they're not negatively impacted. And last but not least, I would say from my experience, it's all about money. You can buy a very calm closure by paying a lot of money. You don't necessarily have to do that, but you have to pay what is the prevailing severance package in that particular location where you're located. And then you can even pay a little bit more, and typically things will go a lot smoother. Okay, let's, if you will, next slide. Let's move on to a couple of case studies. We're going to have 3 case studies. One is a closure and a relocation. Another one is a site selection and relocation, and the third is a pure closure issue. And I'll do the first one, and Dan will do the second one. First one was a automobile parts U.S. company, wholly owned. They were required to move, basically due to environmental concerns and urban renewal. The plant was built in the early 90s. They were given 10 months to move, and they faced a potential fine of $1 million if they couldn't move out. The company really didn't do any planning, and they made a public announcement in the plant, and a strike broke out. The Chinese general manager at the time just didn't know how to deal with it. He also lost face, so to speak, and so he resigned. And there was really no security during this whole exercise, other than a few local guards that were rented, if you will. So next slide. So we were asked to come in and obviously protect the assets, the plant itself, resolve the strike, put a plan in place to move the operation, and most importantly, make sure that there was no disruption in customer shipments. So we hired a general manager, or an interim general manager, and an interim project manager. So they immediately got in place, opened a dialogue with the strikers, talked the company through what the appropriate severance compensation should be, and so forth and so on. Explained that to the employees and the strike leaders, and they were able to luckily end the strike with inside a month. But once that was done, next slide, please.
Jay, real quickly, a question came in. Trying to read the question, but it basically the question is saying what type of employees are the most difficult to deal with when it comes to who are the most militant? Are there certain categories of employees that are, I guess, the most militant or difficult to deal with when you're sizing up a facility to close?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not the ladies in the accounting department. It's generally middle-aged machinists, typically local. Migrant workers do not want to get involved in unrest or strikes. The PSB can be pretty aggressive in those situations. So it's really hard to say. I think older employees, machinists, heavy industrial, who have worked for state-owned enterprises and believe that they're entitled to a job for life. It's not employment at will, if you will. So yeah, I would say it's male machinists, middle age.
Locals, okay.
Yeah, local. Next slide.
All right. And I just switched over. Here we go.
Okay, yeah. So first and foremost, what we had to do is, since we were going to shut the plant down and we had at the same time look for a new location, we had to build inventory in order to serve the clients and keep product moving. So that was prime, and we one of the key tasks, and we basically built inventory in an outside warehouse during this time. Next slide. So as we were building inventory, we kept the dialogue open. The fact that we were paying for 3 shifts, obviously a lot of the employees were making a fair amount of compensation during that time, which was a very positive move. At the same time, we started looking at other sites, and this was a lease building. So we looked for, again, another existing building, and then we developed a plan to design the new layouts for the equipment and the utility drops and peripherals, as well as fit out of the office and so forth. Next slide. New facility. Obviously, we had to use a design institute. They did design. We had a contractor come in, do most of the construction. At the same time, the client had asked us to hire some new staff, new management, which we did at the same time. So hopefully all this was coming together at the same time. The old facility, again, it took some time. We negotiated with the development zone, labor, tax bureaus, and started the closeout facility and the liquidation process. Some of the employees were actually moved over to the new facility. A lot just accepted their severance packages and moved on. Next slide. So at the end of the day, it was a pretty successful operation. It was done within 10 months. There was no fine. Most importantly, customers didn't see any disruption in their product delivery. So that was very positive. All in all, a fairly good engagement.
All right. Second case study would be developing a location strategy, site selection, and relocation of a facility. And in this case, the client was a fine chemical company with both sales and manufacturing around the world, but had been well established in China since the 90s. Their plant was located in the Guangzhou area in a sort of general purpose industrial park, as was not uncommon in the 90s when companies were coming to the region. They had set up a network of product distribution warehouses across the country, which they supplied their major customers from, and they'd been successful over the years, certainly. The situation was changing for them both in their customer location and in the local regulatory environment. So East West was brought in to assess their current situation, current location, and look at a future state footprint that could ease concerns about regulatory activity in their old factory, but also position them to better serve customers and access to suppliers. And we were to both identify property and then assist and project manage the design and construction of the facility. As I mentioned, the facility was in a general purpose industrial zone. They'd had problems with the local regulators. They were having difficulty meeting their increased wastewater treatment standards. We met with the local regulators and zone officials, and we got their take on it. And it was clear that their days really were numbered in their location near Guangzhou. And in the chemical industry in particular, there's been quite an exodus, quite a movement of manufacturers from these older developments to newer zones around, new chemical specific zones around the country. And that's generally positive for a regulatory compliance standpoint, but access to land is limited, and it's getting increasingly harder to find suitable properties in those industrial zones. What we also looked at was the supplier and customer base. And over time, many of the key customers had relocated from the south to the eastern part of the country, Shanghai area, and just west of the Yangtze River Delta. And to the point where 2/3 of their business was in that region, and they were faced with high logistics costs and high warehousing costs and high inventories to be able to support those customers in East China. And we also looked at potential operating cost differences between Guangzhou and East China and chemical parks, and possibly taking advantages of incentives for a new build. Next slide, please, Alex. So we engaged on a site selection. We looked at chemical parks, so we focused it on East China, ranging from Shanghai and then further west into Anhui. Really tried to focus on national level chemical industry parks. The client was interested in being in place for long term, and we felt that was the most least risky to locate in those parks. We looked at investment incentives around the region, and eventually talked to over 20 zones and interviewed over 20 zones for their fit for the client, their ease of doing business, applicable incentives that might be available. And we ended up selecting a site in a national level zone that was about 100 kilometers northwest of Shanghai. So very good access to their suppliers, to their customers, and also to their business offices in Shanghai. Next slide. So once we'd selected a site, worked with a client to negotiate purchase of the property, East West assigned a project manager to oversee the design and construction of the new facility. So with that, we had to develop an overall project plan and scope and a schedule and a budget for the design and construction. We had to interview and qualify design institutes to do the detailed design for the chemical plant. And in the case of a relatively specialized sector like the chemical industry, you've got fewer capable design institutes. So it was important to find those locally that could support the project. Manage the approval processes, the permitting for the safety permits, the environmental permits, building permits, manage that execution of those, which have become more time consuming in the last several years. Much less common to find a fast track for a greenfield site. And set up procurement processes that were transparent. Plant construction in China in particular over the years has been a challenge for business practices, whether or not it's for purchase of equipment or building construction. So we wanted to have best practices around sourcing and transparency. And then through the course of the project, we were called upon to manage some unforeseen circumstances. There was a major change in scope in the middle of the project after we designed the buildings and the basic infrastructure for the site. The decision was to sort of upgrade the technology and become more, rather than a strictly domestic supplier, to increase the scope and range of the manufacturing to support the region. So we managed to incorporate that upgraded technology in the existing footprint.
Hey, Dan, a question came in there regarding the you mentioned around the environmental regulations delay. The question was, how long does it take normally to identify a site? I guess particularly for a company that's having to move for environmental compliance reasons.
It's typically, to identify a site might be 2 months by the time you get through the initial permitting and approvals before you could be ready to build. I would not plan on less than 6 months to do that. You used to be able to do that some years ago. You could see projects go in 3 to 4 months, but that timetable has been stretched as more scrutiny on the design and the safety and environmental safeguards built in the design.
Okay.
And so the results of the project, we had a solid performance. Got a good incentive package based on rebates on land price, based on any certain timetables and milestones of 7.5 million RMB. Logistics and warehousing costs were reduced, estimated about 1.5 million RMB per year, and a substantial one-time cash benefit by being able to reduce inventories by being closer to suppliers and customers of about 15 million. And then operating costs, pretty favorable labor and utility costs at the new site, an overall reduction of 3% in annual operating costs. So successful project. So Jay?
Yeah, case study number 3. We're bumping up against the 1 hour limit, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. This actually turned into a disaster, a real nightmare for the company. They did one thing correct. They hired an outside firm, and then they didn't follow what the outside firm suggested. And the worst case scenario actually came through. This was a state-owned, was purchased as a state-owned enterprise quite a few years ago. They had about 450 employees. Some of the managers said there shouldn't be any problem. Everyone's very loyal, and they shouldn't have any problem with the layoff itself. The plant was going to be moved. No one really was going to have any new jobs. Very few, except some management positions, were transferred. They intended to make a town hall meeting in their large cafeteria, and they were going to fly an expat up from Singapore, U.S. expat, to make the announcement. And at the same time, they couldn't agree on maybe what the severance packages should look like. Next slide. So, we met with them. We developed an overall closure plan, stressing that we needed a client executive who was in charge and a decision maker in town, or not necessarily on site, but in town. It did have a history of militants, labor strikes, not a good employee relations and management relationship. The security was very poor and needed to be augmented. We had recommended an N+3 with a sign out bonus, and they needed to do that at a town hall meeting that should be off site. The press had already been notified, and we're calling the general manager's office wanting to know what was going on. So we helped them develop talking points and so forth. We recommended, again, that a local senior manager do the announcement at a local hotel. And at that point in time, there was general consensus in China about the overall plan, but they wanted to study the plan in Singapore and also in the U.S. to see if there were some ways to save some money and time and so forth. So at the end of the day, the plan was shelved. We were thanked for our advice, and they compensated us, and we were off. They declined to add any security. They had the town hall meeting in the cafeteria. The BP from Singapore came up with and the plant provided a translator. They told the employees during the meeting that they hadn't quite figured out what the severance packages were going to be, and that triggered basically a rush to the podium, so to speak, and they demanded that they know what the severance package is going to be. They locked the doors and held both the management and the expat hostage throughout the evening. It was rather tense. During the evening, the plant was looted. Anything valuable that could be taken was taken. We walked right through the gates. Security didn't do much. The press was reporting based on social media accounts that the company was exploiting Chinese workers and yada, yada, yada. So it turned into a real nightmare. We got a call late in the evening. We had to mobilize some professional staff, enforcement officers to go in with vehicles. We were able to extract the expat and the senior Chinese managers. We had called the Labor Bureau and had them secure the perimeter of the plant so no more theft occurred and so forth and so on. So at the end of the day, they really got a rude awakening of what not to do with a closure. And their brand did suffer for a short period of time after that. Okay, I believe that's it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact Alex Bryan or John Anderson.
And again, we'll have a recording on the website as well as presentation. It's 2:01. We ran 1 minute over. Thank you again for your time and effort, and we look forward to having you on future webinars. Thank you.